The topic is one that the Center has devoted considerable programming to under the leadership of Hala Esfandiari in the Middle East program. Today's meeting is also co-sponsored with the Los Alamos National Laboratory and the project director, Joe Pilot, with whom the Center has been collaborating on more broadly on nuclear nonproliferation issues. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome all of you here today, those who are in this room and in an overflow room, which is indicative of the interest in this topic, as well as those watching us on the live webcast. The Iran nuclear program remains front page news. Recently, Secretary of State Clinton stated that U.S. and multilateral sanctions had slowed down the program. Multilateral negotiations are set to resume in Istanbul between Iran and the P5, so-called P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council in Germany, with the Turkish government facilitating. So it is in that context that we're delighted to have a distinguished panel of experts address different facets of the program. Now, today's meeting on the nuclear program is part of a broader set of issues related to the publication of the Iran Primer, which is a joint project of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the United States Institute of Peace. And the editor and the prime mover behind this project is Robin Wright, who's a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I would like to turn the floor over to her to briefly put today's meeting into the broader context of the Primer, which is available online and is attracted, with reason, enormous attention for the utility it provides, a breadth of coverage of issues in a succinct manner. So, Robin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just want to take 90 seconds to explain that the Iran Project is a very unusual book and web project. The whole book is available online. Although if you print it out, it's cheaper to buy it. I'll tell you, it's that long. And it's also an online project that is updated every couple of days. Samir Naku has been helping the project, making sure the website continues to be up to date with new analysis, fresh, timely analysis every 2 days. It's unusual also in that we brought together over 20 think tanks, 8 universities, 2 former UN weapons inspectors, and the senior administration official or the national security advisor in charge of Iran from the last 6 administrations, dating back to the 1979 revolution. So it's a unique project in trying to look at every single major subject in politics and the opposition, the military, sanctions, U.S. policy options. And it's available at iranprimer.com. for anyone who wants to take a further look. And the 3 speakers today are all authors in this project, as is Hala Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks.
And I'd like to commend Robin for being, as I put it, the prime mover behind this project, but also in putting together from a variety of inputs from different contributors a homogenized kind of form and highly readable and an authoritative reader that I think is a go-to source on Iran. So delighted to be that the Center was able to participate in the overall Primer project, and that today we're boring in on one dimension of it, a key one, the nuclear controversy. We'll hear from 3 of the contributors to the Primer, who are top experts in the field. First, David Albright, President of the Institute for Science and International Security. He'll lead off with a discussion on the state of play of Iranian capabilities and provide context on some of the statements that have been made by senior officials in the United States and overseas on the status of those Iranian capabilities. Then we'll turn to Michael Elleman, who's a senior fellow for regional security cooperation at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I guess it's their satellite office in Bahrain that you're going to be moving to shortly. He's going to focus on the ballistic missile dimension, which he's been working on. And then finally, we'll turn to former senior correspondent at Agence France Presse and current public policy scholar Michael Adler, who will provide an overview of the state of play on the multilateral negotiations to constrain Iran's nuclear ambition. So with that, let me turn the floor over to David Albright. Oh, just one additional word. We will, each of the speakers will lead off for roughly 15 minutes, and then we'll move to discussion. And for those who are on the in the fourth floor participating in the meeting, there will be cards that you can fill out and that will be brought up to feed into the discussion period. So with that, David, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. Who's keeping time? Are you?
Yes, I will keep that.
I can guess. Well, thank you very much. No, happy to be here, and was very excited to be part of the Primer project, and thought it's really made an important contribution to the debate. And Robin was remarkable at getting us to meet deadlines, which was probably even more impressive in all this. I mean, I would like to mostly focus on Iran's nuclear capabilities, but inevitably, I also want to talk about some of the issues involving negotiations, some of the issues involving timelines to the bomb. So I think what I'm going to try to do is cover a lot of ground, and I'm probably going to maybe just the kind of take-home lesson is that the international effort to try to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons has made some substantial progress in the last couple years. It doesn't mean negotiations are going to bear fruit, but there's been a range of things that have been created that are making it harder for Iran to make progress. And Robert alluded to Hillary Clinton's comment recently, and I think it's a very important comment that summarizes the situation, that the sanctions have been working and that technological problems have slowed down Iran's program. And again, I'm a background is in physics. ISIS looks more at the technical side of things. When we say sanctions are working, we don't mean that Iran's on its knees ready to give up its nuclear weapons program. And I would say that anymore, we believe ISIS believe Iran is engaged in an effort to get nuclear weapons. It's also engaged in an effort to build a big civil nuclear program, but it's engaged in this other effort. But when we see sanctions working, Iran has to buy things to have any kind of nuclear facility. It's not indigenously able to make the key materials to put together, let's say, a gas centrifuge plant. And so the sanctions, combined with traditional trade controls, have started to make it harder and harder for Iran to get key goods that they need to both expand their enrichment program at the Natanz fuel enrichment plant and to build new facilities in secret, which they've also announced they're planning to do. So I think that you can't lose sight of that there's another role of sanctions besides trying to force Iran to its knees that are bearing fruit. And the net result is that the program is moving slower, certainly than Iran hoped. And what I'll try to do is talk a little bit more about that and what that means. Most of my comments will be on their gas centrifuge program. I apologize. I'm not going to be talking about what we call the nuclear weaponization program. That's the set of facilities, capabilities to make a nuclear weapon itself. And Iran has been at it a long time. There's debate over whether it's stopped in 2003 or picked up again in 2006 or whatever. But they've worked on nuclear weapons. They developed some pretty sophisticated designs. They had outside help. But importantly, we see no evidence that they've made a decision to build nuclear weapons. So again, when I talk about weaponization, I'm talking about creating a capability to be able to field a nuclear explosive device or a nuclear weapon that's mounted on a missile. And of course, if you're going to make a decision to build nuclear weapons, you probably one of the leaders are going to ask, can you actually do it? And so we've seen this in many countries, that the capability leads the decision, and that they're going to work the scientists, engineers are going to work to be able to answer the question yes and be able to say, look, and we can do it in X amount of months or years. But again, most of my comments are on the enrichment program because in the sense the long pole in the tent is highly enriched uranium right now. You need the nuclear explosive material in order to build a nuclear weapon. And that brings the attention on the enrichment program, which is the program that's furthest along in Iran on being able to make nuclear explosive material. And it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's the centrifuge program, as you probably all know, is not moving nearly as fast as Iran had planned. Believe it or not, in 2003, it said that about now it would be approaching 50,000 centrifuges operational and enriching at the Natanz site, and yet it only has 5,000 centrifuges enriching and another 3,000 or 4,000 that are installed that are not enriching at this point in time. And so they're way behind what they had planned. But even with those machines, there's some problems. And so the machines seem to be working. They're increasing their monthly outputs of low-enriched uranium. Just went up again from about 115, 120 kilograms a month up to about 135 kilograms a month on average. And I mentioned they have 5,000 centrifuges enriching. That's an increase of 1,000 from 4 or 5 months ago. There's also some technical indicators that show that they're running these machines in a somewhat reliable manner. On the other hand, there's some real indications that they're having some trouble, and it isn't produced. These machines aren't producing as much enriched uranium as they should. They should be able to produce considerably more than 135, on average of 135 kilograms a month. The number of enriching centrifuge machines is only about 60% of the total installed. That's a very odd thing for a centrifuge plant. There was an unexplained halt to all enrichment at the fuel enrichment plant at Natanz in mid-November of 2010, which remains unexplained. They also have a high failure rate of centrifuges. And the IAEA can track this. I won't go into why, but they actually get a pretty good indication of how many machines fail at the plant. It has to do with how safeguards work there. But it's about 10% per year crash. We also learned recently that there was a unexplained crashing of about 1,000 centrifuges in late 2009, early 2010. And so in total, we're estimating that 2,000 machines have crashed at the Natanz site. And if with 8,000 or 9,000 installed, then that's a pretty high percentage. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out why this has happened. And U.S. officials will talk about it a little. Your overseas intelligence agencies will talk about it. And you come up with a range of reasons. One is the obvious one, that this is Iran. They're not going to build centrifuges like Germany. And they just have manufacturing and assembling problems. They have problems running. Centrifuges are hooked together in cascades. They have problems running cascades. You have to have control systems. You have to have all kinds of input data from sensors, and it just could be a problem. And we think that's going on. But I think in the last 6 months, I think it's also become apparent that Iran is in a way under an attack by foreign intelligence agencies, and we think that's starting to have an impact. And in this, I don't mean trade controls, sanctions. I mean these would be much more aggressive. Things like cyber attacks. We've been trying to figure out this attack sequence of the Stuxnet worm, and I think before Christmas we published a paper where we're pretty convinced that Natanz was the target. If the point was to destroy all the centrifuges, it obviously failed. But if the point was to shake up operations there, lead to centrifuge failures, disrupt enrichment activities, and in a sense burrow in for the long term and try to remain undiscovered for as long as possible, and during that time interrupt centrifuge operations, it may have succeeded quite well. And that would be one of the reasons why you see so many broken machines and why enrichment output has stayed relatively low. But those are not the only attacks. I mean, the nuclear officials key scientists have been assassinated or wounded in bomb attacks. You have disruption of their Iran smuggling networks. I said they have to go out and buy things for their program. They're not doing it legally. Germany's not going to sell it to them. We're not. So they run smuggling rings to get those items, and laws, export controls inhibit those activities. But intelligence agencies also go out there and try to plant spies in those networks, try to basically disrupt the networks or turn them or undermine what they're trying to do, and put in damaged equipment or bugged equipment. So you're seeing more along those lines. And I think these things do have an effect. On the sanctions and trade controls, the Iran, and we see this because in our work with companies, we advise them on inquiries they may receive that are suspicious. Because in the end, Iran still goes to Western companies, Japanese companies, American companies to buy certain things. I'll just name Maragine steel, carbon fiber, vacuum pumps, pressure transducers, specialized oils, manufacturing equipment. And they have to go out and deceive the supplier, but at some point the person asking has to emerge and send an open inquiry, price quotation, to a company. And companies, particularly in the vacuum industry, well, in all these industries, are much more sophisticated at picking out the suspicious ones. And they're a tiny fraction. One company we work with closely, these suspicious ones are 0.1% of the total number of inquiries they get. But they've become very sophisticated of picking these things out. And so what you have is it's much harder for Iran to get these things. And one of the consequences, we believe, is that they may be running out of a key material they need to make the P1 centrifuge. It's called Maragine steel, and it's the part for the bellows. They need 3 bellows per machine, and they may be running out of it. They may only be able to build a total of 12,000 or maybe no more than 15,000 of these IR1s that are at Natanz. Iran's had problems buying another material called carbon fiber, or Kevlar is another type, and they've been having trouble buying these things, and they need those for the advanced centrifuges they want to build. Because another mystery is they've been developing these things for years, but they haven't deployed them in large numbers at all. And so it could be that material constraints are keeping them from being able to build thousands of these advanced centrifuges. So and that's why I say that sanctions have worked, and they can be improved. Just to quickly mention, I'm going to run out of time soon. China is a major gap in this. China does not implement and enforce its trade controls or its sanctions laws adequately, and you see it over and over again. Iran goes there to buy things, and they're not buying Chinese. I mean, this is the complexity of the issue. They're buying European in China. And what does the European supplier see? It sees a Chinese company asking for vacuum pumps or other items. And the supplier, let's say a German supplier in China, it looks like a domestic sale. Export controls don't even come into play. And then it turns out that company is a front for an Iranian smuggling network, and then they smuggle the equipment out of China. Now, this is an old game, and the Europeans have mastered crushing these kinds of arrangements. So has the United States. Still, stuff gets through. About a year ago, Iran successfully used a California company to buy things domestically, vacuum equipment domestically, we believe, for their centrifuge program and other military programs. And it was busted by ICE. But still, it had set up shop in the United States and was buying things and did get some stuff out. But still, it's a small amount relative to what it could be. In China, it's still a large amount, and it remains a major problem. Let me jump, and then how am I doing for time?
Got about 2 more minutes.
All right. One of the big issues in our community is how soon could Iran have nuclear weapons? And there's 2 parts to this. One is, and I said, we don't think they've made a decision to build nuclear weapons. So really, what are we talking about? It's like, when could Iran have a capability to build nuclear weapons? And then it certainly would have to make a decision to do so. So keep that in mind. There was a recent comment by former head of Mossad in Israel that I think is been misinterpreted, and I'm running out of time, so I want to cut to the chase, is he said that Iran was still far from being capable of producing nuclear weapons and that a series of malfunctions had put off its nuclear goal for several years. Therefore, he said, Iran will not get hold of the bomb before 2015 approximately. And, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu came in soon after and kind of undercut that and said there's the best case, there's the worst case. I think it was put out, Mossad doesn't do the analysis on Iran. They're not the primary intelligence organization in Israel doing analysis of Iran. But that being said, what I would do is contrast that with something that came out of the White House and has been widely reported, is that if Iran wanted to make a dash to nuclear weapons using the Natanz plant, which again is unlikely because we'll know it and it'll probably be bombed, but if it wanted to make a dash to nuclear weapons, it could do so in a year. And so what that's saying is essentially Iran could build nuclear weapons now if it wanted to. It has the capabilities, but it's constrained from doing that by other factors. In this case at Natanz, they're constrained because they'd have to worry about a military strike. We'd certainly learn about this kind of dash at Natanz because it would violate the safeguards and probably require the inspectors to be thrown out. And so you would quickly learn about it, and then Iran would have all these months. Now, we've argued with the White House, we think it's more like 6 months if Iran plans. And we don't think they would just, okay, we're going to now go for a dash, now how do we do it? They're going to plan ahead, and so our estimate is more like 6 months to 12 months, where we emphasize the 6 months. But nonetheless, it's a lot of time, and I think Iran would be constrained. But one of the unfortunate things that's developing, and this is why I think Dagon's comment is unhelpful, is that if Iran develops advanced centrifuges, maybe it can't build 5,000, but it may be able to build 1,000. And these advanced centrifuges are truly advanced, and 1,000 could be more than 5,000 of the P1s or the IR1s. And so you have to worry that with a much smaller number of centrifuges, Iran will be able to make the same amount of enriched uranium and have, in a sense, the same dash time. But maybe it'll do it at a secret site. And adding complexity to that is Iran has made it clear they're building secret enrichment sites. Yeah, eventually they'll tell the international inspectors about them, but essentially not till those plants are finished. They've also said they're going to build 10, and we think they're just playing a shell game, where, if you remember the Qom site, that was one of the, well, they got caught. Well, it was one of the 10. We told you we didn't have to tell you. And activities have slowed down there, and they've announced that starting in March they're going to build another one. And so you have we think they're going to keep trying to keep a secret capability in place or develop one. And so it actually makes a lot of uncertainty about this whole situation. And I think comments like, well, they can't do anything till 2015 are probably misleading if taken at face value. And I think, just to add, Hillary Clinton made it very apparent in her statement that she had problems with what Dagon said. She said, look, yeah, we have more time. I'm paraphrasing, but we don't have a lot more time. And you can't postpone the key decisions and the key actions because Iran is moving toward getting nuclear weapons, and we need to move forward now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Turn down to Michael Elliman, who will focus on the ballistic missile dimension.
Okay, thank you. What I'm going to talk about today is primarily derived from a much larger study that was conducted by the International Institute of Strategic Studies. This is the publication. I was the primary author, but I benefited greatly from a number of participants, and I think this is something that made the study we did rather unique. Participants from not only the United States, but from Russia, Germany, France, some specialists in the Middle East, all of whom have had experience developing, producing, testing, fielding ballistic missiles at some point in their professional career. So I think it provided somewhat of a unique perspective to really assess what Iran's capabilities for producing ballistic missiles is today and will be in the near-term future. The study looks at not the threat posed by Iran's missiles. We did not try to address the intent. We specifically looked at the technical capabilities that Iran has. We built on the studies that others have done, like the East-West Institute. Uzi Rubin has published quite a bit on the subject. But instead of taking a static picture of where Iran stands today in capability, we instead tried to look at what systems do they have today, what indigenous production and development capabilities do they have now, and how do we see that changing in the future. And probably most importantly is to identify some of the key activities that Iran would have to undertake to develop future, more capable systems. And with those signatures, use it as a means to monitor or measure the progress that Iran might make. Just a final note, I guess I do have some slides which I should throw up here. And we have taken what we call the most likely outcome view. This is not a worst case or best case scenario about what Iran may or may not be able to do in the future. Rather, it's based on historical precedents. What's the most likely outcome to anticipate?
I want to just close the box on the left, that panel of showing all your slides, just to.
I'm not sure I know I can do that without screwing it up, but yeah, why don't you, I might just erase the whole thing. Okay. Okay. Here's a list of the inventory that Iran has. They have assembled the largest, most diverse inventory of ballistic missiles and rockets in the Middle East. It's not necessarily the most capable. I think that would be fall to Israel. But nonetheless, you can see that it's a wide inventory. I mean, to date, they have probably 1,000 of these long-range artillery rockets, highly inaccurate, mostly used to affect battles. They have a few hundred of the Shahab 1s and 2s. This is just a modified Scud B or Scud C. Maybe a dozen or two of the more capable medium-range Shahab 3 or Ghadar 1. And they're developing some newer systems that I'll talk about. But the number of missiles isn't necessarily the most important thing to always look at. It's the number of launchers the country has and the number of trained crews that they have in their possession. And it looks like Iran is probably got a dozen or two launch crews and launchers. The two missiles of greatest concern here would be the Ghadar 1, which is in final testing. It may actually be deployed. It has a range of about 1,600 kilometers, meaning it's quite capable of reaching targets throughout the Middle East, including Israel. And under development is this new two-stage solid propellant missile, the Sajil 2. It's a couple of years away, and I'll talk about that system in a little bit. Just to give you a general view of the range capabilities, right now with the medium-range systems, they can reach throughout the Middle East, as I mentioned, Turkey. In the future, with the Sajil, they might be able to reach targets in the very southeast corridor of Europe. But I'd urge one bit of caution here. Range is very sensitive to the actual payload weight. And so the size of the bomb that Iran may or may not develop will play a critical role in determining how far the missile can actually fly. Just as a measure, for every extra kilogram of weight that the warhead has, it reduces the range of the missile on the order of 1.5 kilometers. Now, the basis for Iran's current ballistic missile forces derive from two basic components, either the Scud engine, which is used for the Shahab 1s and 2s, and the Nodong engine. And here is just a way of illustrating how they have taken essentially the same missile and made kind of stepwise improvements on them. You move from the Shahab 3, which is just the Nodong missile they imported from North Korea, and they slowly made improvements with lighter weight materials, extending the fuel tanks, etc. And you end up with the Ghadar 1, which has a much greater range capability. They've also exploited this to develop a two-stage space launcher, the Safir, which put a small satellite into orbit 2 years ago. And they have some ambitions to develop a much larger space launcher, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Again, just give you a feel for how their range capabilities have improved over time. This just shows you that about every 5 years they're able to make about an approximate step forward. This isn't a very useful predictive tool, but it does show you that they've made slow, steady progress, which I think indicates the determination and priority they've assigned to their missile programs. The space launcher capabilities. Now, in addition to having this very robust missile development program, they have a very ambitious space launch effort ongoing. They actually have a stated goal of putting a man into space sometime early next decade. I don't think that's an unreasonable goal for Iran, provided they are able to continue along the same line of progress that they're making today. Last February, they unveiled this new launcher called the Simorgh. It's just a mock-up that they showed, but they did also, I guess, showcase a cluster of 4 Nodong engines which would be used to power this system. They hope to actually use this launcher in February or March of this year. It will be very powerful. It will be really a tremendous first step into reaching their space launch goals. As a ballistic missile, this thing would be capable of intermediate ranges, meaning it could, if converted, be used to target Western Europe. I'll talk about this later, time permitting, but the conversion of space launchers to ballistic missiles is not as straightforward as some people would indicate, and I'll talk a little bit about those challenges. Probably the most worrisome thing that Iran has done is the move to solid propellant technologies, quite different from the Scud and Nodong technologies they've relied on in the past. If you remember the scene from The Graduate where Dustin Hoffman's approached by someone and they told him the future, it's in plastics. Well, if you were to draw a similar lesson and apply it to ballistic missile development, the future is solid propellants. And again, I don't have time to discuss why that's the case, but I'd be happy to talk about that in the question and answer period. But suffice it to say that Iran's developed this new kind of semi-guided artillery rocket, the Fatah 110. This is a system that's probably been exported to Lebanon. It's called the M600. It's not as accurate as some people are claiming, but it is a step forward. But the real kind of crown jewel to their development of late is the Sigil 2. It's a 2-stage solid propellant system. It first was tested in 2007. That test failed, and then they began testing in late 2008. They've done 3 or 4 tests to date. They've got a long way to go to make this a viable combat system. At a minimum, 2 years, possibly as long as 5 years before it's an operational system. But I would note that Iran is now the first country to develop a 2,000-kilometer range missile without first having developed a nuclear weapon. Now, what does that mean? It's hard to say. I'll leave that to others. But it's just kind of a unique feature to their program. What might Iran use the missiles for? The most obvious thing is nuclear weapons. I'll talk about that in a moment. But as strictly a military item, it doesn't have much utility. They lack the accuracy needed to actually destroy military targets. This graph is quite confusing, but nonetheless, what I'm attempting to show is that the best case scenario for these Shahab missiles is for them to be able to hit a designated target and destroy it. At best, it's 1 in 100 and more likely 1 in 1,000 probability. Expressed differently, if a military commander decided a specific command and control center was to be taken out using their missiles, to have about 75 or 90% confidence levels that that facility would be destroyed, they'd have to launch 1,000 missiles. So obviously they don't have much military utility. They could disrupt military operations and airfields, things like that, but it would not be decisive. It's more likely that the missiles would be used as a terror weapon to sow fear and break political resolve. But if one looks historically at missile attacks on cities, large missiles, 1,000-kilogram warheads, the average number of deaths per missile is on the order of 2. Iran has a couple hundred missiles. So, if you want to look at it in a very cold-hearted fashion, it's really not even an effective tool for or at least for killing people. For sowing terror, that might be another story. Just to mention, civil defense measures, simply early warning, you could reduce the number of casualties by about half based on historical data. Obviously, the more logical use of the ballistic missile is for a nuclear weapon, but that's assuming Iran can make the weapon small enough. And this is an area that I think David and my colleagues could address much more effectively than I can. I'm just a missile engineer, not a nuclear one. But the size of the payload bay for Iran's missiles is quite small, about 600 millimeters in diameter, maximum payload capacity on the order of 1 ton. If you look historically, the chart, the bottom chart shows that making a bomb of that size and those dimensions required the United States about 15 years after the first test to achieve that capability. The same goes for Russia, same goes for China. However, there is proliferation of bomb designs on the market, and again, David could address this much more ably than I can. But I think that is the key challenge that Iran will face, is making the bombs small enough. The status of Iran's industries, obviously it's been a priority investment. They've probably spent over $1 billion to date. They are becoming more self-reliant. They're not there yet. They still have to import key materials, components. They cannot develop new liquid propellant rocket engines. They have to rely on those that they have or can get from places like North Korea, that is the Scud and Nodong engines. I'll talk about the BM-25 in a moment and what the ramifications might be as this was leaked in the WikiLeaks release very recently. Iran has created a very capable industrial capacity for making solid propellants. This is where they'll go. I don't think there are any obvious barriers for them to design and build whatever size rocket motor they need for long-range systems. The key issue for them, well, it takes a tremendous amount of time and a lot of resources. The average time to develop a new solid rocket motor for a missile is on the order of 2 to 5 years. That can be done in secret, but after the actual engine or motor has been developed, it's another 4 years of flight testing on average for programs around the world. This is something that cannot be avoided and cannot be hidden. So we do have a capability of seeing well in advance when Iran will have more capacity in terms of range and payload. I think the great legacy that Iran has, or from this era, the last 10 years, has been the management structure that Iran has created and applied to their missile development programs. This is what other countries have really lacked. The discipline and the structured environment allows them to do what they want to do over the long term. North Korea has not taken this path, and as a result, they've done things in a much more willy-nilly fashion. And I think our judgment is that Iran has surpassed North Korea in capability today. Final note, Iran's missiles are inaccurate today, and they will remain so for the foreseeable future. Contrary to a lot of myths out there, GPS is not the magic bullet that will allow you to achieve a greater accuracy, and I can explain why in the question and answers. The bottom line, what people really want to know is how long will it take Iran to build viable, longer range systems? I'm probably running out of time, so I'll skip through this. But with the liquid propellant technologies they have today, that is the Scud and Nodong technologies, you can't really make a combat missile in this day and age. It would be too vulnerable to preemption because it's so large. We're talking something on the order of 100 tons. It can't be made mobile. You could put it in a silo, but Iran has a fairly limited size country, and the surveillance capabilities today would make targeting quite easy. I'll talk a little bit about why they can't really convert the space launch vehicle. Secretary Gates made a very interesting comment 2 days ago about North Korea's capabilities. Okay. Bottom line is they will probably seek to exploit their solid propellant capabilities. The Sigil 2, which is still under development, they could create a 3-stage version of it to target cities or whatever 3,500 kilometers away. This would be risky. It'd still require a 2 to 5 year flight test program. a second-generation IRBM based on larger solid propellant rocket motors. Based on all the historical evidence of other countries that have attempted to do this, it's probably 6 to 10 years away. If you break it down in other ways, you come up with the same answer. Iran's disciplined approach means that they'll probably try to develop an intermediate-range missile before an ICBM, and we are very confident that a notional 9,000-kilometer range ICBM is beyond Iran's capacity in this decade. It'll be at least 2020 before they have an operationally viable system. That is not much different than what the DIA said when they mentioned that Iran could test an ICBM by 2015. If you recall what I said earlier, flight test programs are an absolute necessity. They take time. If you add the 3 to 5 years needed, you again end up with this end of the decade projection. Word about WikiLeaks. North Korea paraded 2 missiles recently in October. One of them looks very much like the Goddard-1, an indication that there's a lot of cooperation between North Korea and Iran. Not a surprise there. The more interesting thing was the BM-25 or R-27, so based on the Russian submarine-launched R-27 missile. This was mentioned in WikiLeaks. Again, talk about this later. Essentially, it's a submarine-launched missile developed by Makeyev. We know Makeyev has been active in North Korea over the years. And in Iran. It has a maximum range of 2,400 kilometers with a 650-kilogram warhead, that's quite a small warhead, actually. It's smaller than what's on the Goddard-1 today. The bottom line is, to make this into a road mobile system, you have to add structural reinforcements because the submarine-based environment that the Russians had designed this system for is much more benign. Moreover, the higher energy propellants used in this system that makes it more capable are extremely sensitive to changes in temperature. So therefore, you have to create a mechanism for protecting it when you deploy it on a mobile launcher. That requires either a launch canister or a change in the oxidizer. If you change the oxidizer, you reduce the amount of energy available, reduces the range. Bottom line, maximum range, this new system, even though it's been lengthened, is about 2,400 kilometers, probably closer to 2,200 kilometers. Not much more than what they'll get out of the Sigil. I would stress this is a new missile. It requires 3 to 5 years of testing. It is not even derived from it's derived from the technologies of an existing system, but it is a new system. You can't just deploy it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Finally, we'll hear from Michael Adler regarding the multilateral diplomacy.
It's very interesting to follow David and Michael because the world diplomacy obviously has less precision, less hardware, certainly a lot less certainty than any analysis of an actual program. But, of course, it's driven so much by that. And I wanted to kind of look at the diplomatic process in this Iranian nuclear crisis, just to try to give you a feel for how things have gone. The crisis started in 2002 when secret Iranian sites were discovered, and an investigation by the UN nuclear watchdog began in 2003. So this is almost a decade of intense diplomacy, and diplomacy where sometimes you feel that you're not getting anywhere, and you're just going back to the same thing again and again. But I think it's key to analyze what time means in this crisis, because if there is one thing this crisis is about, it is time. And in the beginning, there were 2 timelines in the Western analysis of the showdown. There is the timeline for pressure, such as from sanctions, and at what point it forces either regime change or a change in the behavior of the Islamic Republic. Then there is a timeline for when Iran gets the bomb. And diplomats would always have those 2 timelines, and sadly, they would conclude that the timeline for them getting a bomb would be inevitably faster than any timeline for being able to negotiate from them getting the bomb. And this certainly informed the early years of diplomacy, which was very frustrating, which the United States and its allies had a hard time finding a good lineup. Europe was leading this diplomacy, the United States was in the background. And the feeling during that time was that whatever they did, Iran was managing to stall. And while it was stalling, engaging in a lot of talk, it was still developing its nuclear program. Now, one thing that's very important to note is that Iran insists that its program is a peaceful effort to generate electricity. And from the Iranian point of view, there is a U.S.-led campaign that is a political campaign, not a technical campaign, to keep it down. So I think we should never lose sight that Iran does have a point of view, and their point of view is that they have a civilian nuclear program, despite the overwhelming evidence being such that there is no economic sense for what they're doing unless it were to at least have the capacity to make nuclear weapons. But lately, and obviously in a large part because of what David was talking about, there is a new spring in the step of diplomats from at least 4 of the 6 world powers negotiating with Iran. That is the United States, Britain, France, and Germany. And there is a grudging falling into line from the other 2 nations, Russia and China. Time for once seems not to be playing in Iran's favor. There is the coming to office in Washington of Barack Obama and his drive in 2009 to reset relations with Iran by offering serious engagement. This was accompanied, of course, by the resetting of relations with Russia, in a large part by serious arms control and other non-proliferation initiatives. The connect between the two was that Iran's continued defiance of the international community over fears it seeks nuclear weapons were a non-proliferation problem for all, which in the new reset world would get strong cooperation from Russia and China. This was a global policy, both metaphorically and not metaphorically, by the Obama administration to make the Iran issue a non-proliferation issue, not a showdown between the United States and Iran over power politics. And at the same time, the United States took a lot of measures, arms control agreement with Russia, a new nuclear posture review to stress non-proliferation over any offensive military action. And this brings us to 2010, when, despite these efforts, engagement had failed, and the effort to put pressure on Iran came with increased sanctions and other economic measures from the United Nations, but also bilaterally from the United States, bilaterally from the European Union, and even from countries like Japan, South Korea, and to some extent that non-aligned giant India. Of course, Iran did not help itself. It was caught hiding the construction of a second enrichment facility. Remember that this crisis began when it was caught hiding 2 nuclear facilities in 2002, and then in 2009 there was the enrichment facility at Qom. And it backed out of a fuel swap deal to ship out most of its enriched uranium as a confidence-building measure. And I think this is clear, but enriched uranium is a strategic material since it can be used to power civilian reactors, but it is also the raw material for making an atomic bomb. And along the way, one crucial piece of timing changed. Iran's march to create an industrial level of uranium enrichment to power more and more centrifuges to refine out enriched uranium stalled. Now, David has explained this at length, so I won't go into it again. But I would like to point out that the comments by Dagan, the outgoing Israeli Mossad chief, only confirmed a trend U.S. officials have been hinting at for months, that Iran is farther away from key steps towards getting a bomb, such as making the high-enriched uranium necessary, than we had thought. And so what had been an endgame of escalating pressure has become an opening for diplomacy, time free of the need to face the decision whether to live with Iran with a bomb or to bomb Iran to prevent this. So the key is that after years of following diplomacy where the United States and the other 5 world powers felt that they were unable to come to grips with Iran because they felt both the pressure of time and both the Iranian intransigence, we now have a moment, we don't know for how long, when the door is open to diplomacy and when there is this dual U.S. policy of engagement and sanctions. And fittingly, the Iranians are once again engaging, and they held a first meeting in Geneva in December, resuming a process broken off since October 2009. And as Rob said, there's a meeting coming up next week in Istanbul. Now, in Geneva, there were no breakthroughs. Those meetings took place. The Iranians spoke first in the morning. No, the P5+1 spoke first in the morning, and they presented their positions. They spoke for about 2-3 hours. They broke for lunch. There was no bilateral meeting between the United States and Iran, which made the meeting less of a possible breakthrough than the past. And in the afternoon, the Iranians spoke, and they presented their positions. But what was positive in Geneva was that the Iranians directly addressed the nuclear issue and expressed their concerns about the nuclear issue, why they felt they were being unfairly singled out, and they had a willingness to talk about that, because before the meeting, the Iranians had said they were willing to talk to the world community, but they wanted to talk about issues that they care about, which is the failure of capitalism, the lack of religion in world politics, and certainly the lack of direction of the United States and its unfair attempt to influence countries in the Persian Gulf. So, and U.S. officials coming into Geneva were actually, they didn't just have low expectations, they wanted to have low expectations. Because in October 2009, at the previous meeting, there had been, the fuel swap deal had been almost a surprise success. And the deal was to ship out most of the low-enriched uranium which Iran has. And this would be a confidence-building measure, because if they don't have the uranium, there's no way they can build the bomb. And what was good about the deal for Iran was that even if they shipped out the uranium, they could continue enriching. So in a sense, it was a sort of de facto recognition of their right to enrichment, I feel. And the one goal of Iran in this process is to have their right to enrichment acknowledged. Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has an article which describes the inalienable rights of states to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Iran points to that article saying it has the right to enrich. It's a signatory to the NPT. It is under repeated investigations by the IAEA. Nothing has been found of diversion of nuclear material for military purposes, and therefore it has the right to enrich it. And the one consistent, key, stubborn Iranian goal throughout this process is that its right to enrich being realized. And they say that if that is accepted, that they can do that, then they would be more willing to talk. In any case, Istanbul will be the test of whether they can start talking. Expectations, once again, are low. Iran has ahead of the talks, invited non-aligned and other diplomats for a tour of their nuclear facilities. This is more an attempt at public relations than an inspection. The inspection is done by the UN Nuclear Agency, which has been investigating the Iranian program since 2003 and still has key questions about the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear work. More seriously, Iranian Foreign Minister and head of its atomic program, Ali Akbar Salehi, said this week that Iran would not discuss its nuclear dossier at the Istanbul talks. Now, since the one accomplishment at Geneva had been that this issue was discussed, this does not bode well for what's coming up. But always in these talks, there is a lot of verbiage, a lot of posturing ahead of the talks, and I think the proof will be in the pudding to see what happens in Istanbul. I think the United States would be happy at these talks in Istanbul if Iran showed itself willing to discuss ways to build confidence, such as being more forthright about its nuclear plans. One thing that had been mentioned off the record in Geneva was that one small step could be that Iran would give early notification about its plans to build facilities, because right now it doesn't do that, and it actually is required to do that under agreements it has signed. But I don't think U.S. officials are expecting this to be agreed on. They would be happy if Iran would say in Istanbul, well, you're right, we should talk about that. And the fact that they'd be willing to talk about something so specific, that they will be willing to talk about an actual confidence-building measure, would be miles away from them saying we don't want to talk about the nuclear, we want to talk about world peace. So I think that's what we should expect from Istanbul. And I think that what happens even if Istanbul turns out to be a failure, I think there'll be at least one meeting after that. And then I think at that point, if Iran does not want to discuss on the nuclear issue, I think the P5+1 will say, we're happy to talk to you, but let's stop talks to now. Now, what also is key, and this will be possibly broached, but it will not be resolved in Istanbul, and this could be the confidence-building measure going forward, is this fuel swap deal, which failed in October 2009. Now, Iran, along with Turkey and Brazil, negotiated an agreement to ship out the 1,200 kilograms of enriched uranium. But this is not acceptable to the P5+1 because Iran has made so much more uranium since then. The October deal was to ship out 1,200 kilograms to be processed into fuel for a research reactor in Tehran, which makes medical isotopes. Iran had some 1,600 kilograms of enriched uranium stockpiled at that point. which is roughly the estimate of what they would need for about one bomb in an inefficient first try at this. Iran now has some 3,000 kilograms, and the goal is to leave them with only 400 kilograms, the amount they would have been left with in the 2009 deal. Now, whether Iran would accept to ship out 2,600 kilograms of uranium, which is more than they need to make fuel for the Tehran reactor, is, I think, highly unlikely. But then it's also the question of what could be given in return further down the road. I don't know what that could be, possibly letting Iran continue some enrichment. In any case, I think this is the first step that the P5+1 wants, and since Iran is sure to be opposed to it, it's like a ballgame, but let's see what happens when they get together. And looking further ahead, U.S. policy is more supple than it appears. It is, after all, a policy designed to cut off the crisis before the ugly pass of having to decide whether to go to war. U.S. officials know confidence can only be built in stages and talk a lot about confidence building as the key to this phased approach. But they also know that the Iranians will have to have a settlement they can sell to their own public. And that is why letting them keep some enrichment may be way down the road the way an actual settlement takes place. Now the question is it too late? Will Iran compromise? I'd like to give quickly two Iranian points of view. I spoke to a senior official close to Ahmadinejad, and I asked him if Iran would accept to give up enrichment, because one of the requirements for starting serious talks is that Iran suspend enrichment. Although the United States says we're not asking to suspend forever, just for a short period of time. But the comment from the senior aide to Ahmadinejad was, now the situation is different. We have changed the course and we have started a process. That is their enrichment program, the facts on the ground. So it is unreasonable for the other side to ask for a return to the time before that. I want to recommend that you must be sure Iran's rights for uranium enrichment must be recognized. They must trust us. And I spoke to one of the former negotiators for Iran, and he said to me that he had tried to get the compromise on enrichment that has reduced uranium enrichment by Iran through in about 2005, 2006. His comment, now it is too late. Iran would not accept a compromise on enrichment. He said Iran, and this goes with what a lot of people feel, has not made the decision to make the bomb, but that pressure and sanctions would push the Islamic Republic to do just that. The least one can say is that this is a situation without any good answers. This is where the time element comes in again. And this is why the current round of diplomacy is so important, and why success in Istanbul will be the beginning of a process rather than any concrete result. One U.S. point of view is, frankly, that it's not so bad just to kick the can down the road, to keep on talking in the hope that the situation will change and open up to a solution. Because the end game does not look pleasant if it is a choice between living with, trying to contain a nuclear-armed Iran, or taking up arms against it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just open up the discussion, picking up on the presentations by David and Michael. And as I ask the question and they respond, those who are bringing questions from the fourth floor may do so, and we'll feed them into the process. David, in your presentation, you talked about technology denial and sabotage as being factors that have slowed down the program, that the regime has not made a decision whether to weaponize. The Iranian nuclear program is it's not a crash program to get a nuclear weapon as quickly as possible. It's determined, it's incremental, and in the current period, they're experiencing these difficulties, which appear to have maybe not be explicitly, but do relate to the discussions of maybe half a year ago about the military option and the need to kind of move to that quickly. So it seems that the developments you pointed to on the capability side, one dimension of it in terms of political consequences has been to kind of ease off the discussion about a military option. And Michael, you talked about the enrichment program and this sort of intractable political situation where the Iranians, assert an Article 4 right under the NPT to enrich uranium, and the P5+1, correctly argue that Article 4 does not trump Article 2 and to acquire nuclear weapons. And the question of whether there's some type of workout that would allow for a circumscribed enrichment program, but one that would be transparent and such that there's an inherent hedge involved in enrichment, but capabilities, but that it would be kind of one that outside powers, could live with, so to speak. So could you just react to those
Which
comments?
order does it matter?
Pardon?
Who first?
Please go ahead, David.
One thing, Michael raised the issue of the size. I mean, based on the IA's information, the warhead that Iran is working to develop is well within those parameters of the Shahid-3 warhead. I mean, they're looking at something 40 centimeters in diameter and weighs about, or has a mass of about 200 kilograms. So they're not there yet. There's questions of reliability. It's hard for a warhead to survive in the environment that it would experience with a missile launch and reentry. So, but still, that's their target, and they've been there a long time. I mean, they had some pretty significant help from a Russian weaponeer. We think they probably got some information passed from Pakistan. Pakistan is miniaturized down to this level quite a long time ago, and so they're certainly thinking about putting a nuclear warhead on one of these missiles. What Rob said about the thing about political consequence I'd like to focus on is there is a lot of frustration with the military option. This isn't like what Israel did with Syria or in Iraq in '81. And those stories aren't over, or let's say the Syrian story isn't over. I mean, we at ISIS believe they're probably still planning to build something if they're not already working on some kind of covert activity. They're just short-term fixes in the end. They don't change the nature of what the regime in Syria wants. But a reactor is an object that someone usually builds or buys. They don't usually in these kind of countries have a capability to make a reactor. You knock out the reactor, you've really set them back significantly. Centrifuge program is totally different. You don't build a centrifuge plant without the ability to make them. And so you can knock out into Natanz, you can knock out some other sites, but it's going to be very hard to knock out their ability to make centrifuges. And one of the unfortunate realities of centrifuges and a weapons program versus a civil electricity production program is that Iran needs 5,000 IR-1s operating at Natanz to produce just the minimal amount of low-enriched uranium that the Bushehr reactor would need. It only needs less than 10,000, 5,000 to have a bomb program. And what happens in a military option, unfortunately, is we don't really know, has Iran stockpiled 3,000 centrifuges? Can it make 1,000 of the advanced centrifuges? And after bombing, all it tries to do is build a bomb. And so you can't provide assurance that a military strike against their nuclear sites is going to really do what Israel did to Syria in 2007. And so it does create a lot of problems. And therefore, options are desirable. And I think at ISIS, we're not real supportive of Stuxnet because of its collateral damage, which just tune into the cyber world to listen to. But the idea isn't bad to go after what are essentially illegal facilities. I mean, I hate to be blunt. I mean, the UN Security Council has said that site should stop enriching. And some take those UN Security Council resolutions more seriously than others. So if there's a tool that can, in essence, hurt an illegal facility without causing any human loss or any real serious economic dislocation to a country, shouldn't we consider those options? And so I think that there's a spectrum where we see sanctions, diplomacy on one end, military options on the other, and there's quite a bit of distance between those two, and that I think the people are trying to fill that in and try to solve this problem using more muscular methods without crossing that threshold. And one of the things we found, interestingly enough, in Stuxnet tax sequence is that if it'd be very easy to have made the code so you just basically ramp up the speed of the centrifuge till they all break. I mean, but what we found is that the speed, the rated increase of speed doesn't necessarily get to those speeds that were all going to crash. Same, there was an attack to raise the speed. There's an attack to lower the speed. On the lowering the speed, they don't get anywhere near where they would run into a problem of all of them crashing. And on the upscale, we're not sure yet completely, but it looks like a lot of them would survive, and the attackers knew that. So it looks like that this wasn't an attempt to destroy all the centrifuges, which Iran may have perceived as an act of war. I mean, this is another dimension to this, is that perhaps part of Stuxnet is its aim was to do damage, but not to cross a threshold where it could be interpreted as an aggressive action from one state against another. So let me end it there. I'm talking too much.
No, thank you very much, David, for expanding on that. Michael?
Just
building on the comment, which I guess the same question coming from downstairs, which is under what circumstances would Iran agree to greater transparency for its nuclear
Right.
program, such as the additional protocol? I mean, there seemed to be a lot of discussion about some type of circumscribed enrichment program that, allows them to assert their Article 4 right while providing assurance that it's not a
Right.
clandestine weapons program.
Just one quick thing about putting a payload on a missile. One of the main issues in the IA investigation is something called the alleged studies. And the alleged studies are documents that were smuggled out of Iran, which Iran says are fabrications, but the IA takes them seriously. And among these are two small videos. And one video in the alleged studies shows a missile coming down, and it has the altitude at which it sets off, and boom, there's an explosion. And that altitude corresponds exactly to where an atomic bomb would have to be set off. And the other video, which was shown to the IAEA, never been shown publicly, is something, it's almost kitschy. They have a missile cone on the floor, and inside the missile is a big red pulsating ball. And there's some martial music playing, and you see the ball pulsating, and that's supposed to be the weapon inside the missile. As for the solution that might come and what way it could work out, there have been, Iran gives many signals in lots of ways, and in the comments I had with the Ayatollah Ahmadinejad, he expressed a great openness to talk about solutions, and was very upset about the TRR deal because he felt the United States was trying to impose something, but did not rule out them agreeing to some sort of deal. Another Iranian I spoke to said, very surprisingly, that Iran would be open to buying its enriched uranium abroad, and because one, pride is still expensive, that they insist on having their right to enrich, but would be willing to buy it abroad. This was the brother of Ali Larijani, who's the Speaker of Parliament. For whom he's speaking, for what it means, I don't know, but he was in New York saying these things. So, at the same time, remember, when you speak to U.S. officials, they both stress the Article 4 right of Iran, the fact that they're not in compliance with Articles 1 and 2, which mean you can't be trying to make nuclear weapons or trafficking in technology to make nuclear weapons. But they also say that while it is the UN requirement for Iran to suspend uranium enrichment in order to start talks, no one's saying how long that has to last. So it makes you wonder what could come down the road, further down the road. Now, in some of the discussions about the fuel swap proposal, one thing that was proposed was that they would ship out more than the 1,200 kilograms needed to make the fuel for the Tehran research reactor. And they would take the extra low-enriched uranium that was shipped out and use it to make fuel for Bushehr, so that the low-enriched uranium would be both taken out of Iran and used for what were definitely civilian purposes. Certain countries were unhappy with that. They thought it was encouraging Iran, and that proposal did not fly, but it was discussed. But what seems to be agreed on further down the road, if it were possible, would be that there would be a lot of monitoring of the Iranian nuclear program. Now, the additional protocol, Iran suspended that, applying that in February 2006 when they were cited for noncompliance by the UN Nuclear Agency and sent to the UN Security Council, which eventually imposed sanctions. But Iran has said that it would be willing to apply all these transparency measures if their right to enrich were recognized. So a possible deal down the road would be an additional protocol, maybe an additional protocol plus, so that they would be very well monitored, that the fuel they made, the low-enriched uranium they made, would be shipped out of the country to be made into fuel for their reactors. And in this way, they would both be making it, they'd be asserting their NPT right to make nuclear fuel, but there'd be no way they could use any of it for military purposes. Just one tiny last thing, and I think David might want to expand on this. There was a request by a country to the IAEA a few years back asking them if Iran is allowed to enrich just a little bit, is that still a threat of proliferation? And actually, the IAEA experts came back with the answer that even when you're turning a small number of centrifuges, you still will be learning enough to eventually master enrichment fully, expand your program, and at that point, you could make nuclear weapons. So that would be the argument against allowing some enrichment. The U.S. position is officially not one centrifuge turning, but I think the reality is that there will be eventually a limit, if there's a peaceful settlement, a limited Iranian enrichment program along the lines that I just outlined.
Thank you. Comments and questions from the floor? And we'll start with the microphone here. This gentleman, if speakers could please identify themselves and ask questions, not comments, please.
My name is James Steckert. I'm unaffiliated. And I've got a question. Assuming that the Iranian program is indeed a weapons program, what would be their weapons testing requirements, and is there any evidence that they are currently planning for such requirements?
Well, I'll get to go to David Albright. I guess uranium enrichment really doesn't require the same type of testing that the plutonium route does, since the Hiroshima bomb was never tested. So that was the first use was to the test.
The Iranian program is designed to develop a warhead without requiring full-scale nuclear testing. I mean, they would certainly. It may be that what Iran would actually do if it went to build nuclear weapons is somewhat like North Korea, just get whatever you can quickly and detonate it underground to establish some kind of capability, and let others wonder how many you actually have and if they're deliverable by missiles or aircraft or ships or whatever. So, and Iran is fully able to do that, but the designs it's working on do not require testing, and that's why they've sought foreign help. I mean, one person, one of the Russian, and this is well documented by the IA that helped them, had something like 30 years experience in the Russian nuclear weapons program. Was a real expert on high explosives and initiation, and he helped Iran for several years. And so he wasn't there to build the bomb for them, but he played a very important role in the development of certain components. And we also think they probably have gotten some kind of designs out of this kind of black market that Khan was involved in. So I think that's the name of the game in many of these countries. Iraq, the same thing. I mean, I asked the father of the atomic bomb program this in '96. What did you intend to do? And he said the first few devices were certainly not for testing, but they were going to build a test site too. And I would expect that Iran does have plans to build a test site if it's going to go down this route. The alleged document, or these laptop documents, contain information that suggests that they are making plans to do that.
Halas Fendiari, Kendra, thank you.
Thank you. A question to Mike and first of all, who is in charge of Iran's missiles program? And is your sense, and also maybe David's sense, that there is a close cooperation between the people who run the nuclear program and the people who run the missile program? And secondly, where are the missiles installed? I mean, we hear stories that they're already there to protect the nuclear facilities, certain dams, certain power plants? I mean, what do we know about it? Thank you.
That's air defense versus ballistic missiles, I guess. And
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that there have been some reports in the press or claims by Iran that they've reverse engineered the S-300, which is this very capable Russian air defense system. I find those claims, I'm very dubious about the claims. I think it's quite possible they've built the actual booster rocket for the S-300, but not the sensors and all the radars that would go with it. The other thing, even if they were to receive the S-300s from Russia, it's our understanding that they don't have the entire architecture to really take advantage of the S-300, so it would only marginally improve their air defense capabilities. In terms of who's in charge of the missile programs, undoubtedly it's the IRGC. They handle the deployments, and they're in charge of the different brigades that actually field the missiles. We don't know a whole lot about the locations of where they have them deployed. Most of the reporting that I've seen indicates that they're closer to the western border. There have been reports that they're building silos in Tabriz area. That's quite possible. But to date, they have relied on mobility using, tractor trailers that they've modified to actually be able to carry and erect the missile to launch it, which is in itself is quite an achievement. So you asked me one other question, and I didn't get it written down, so I apologize. Yeah. Quite frankly, I don't know. I've seen reports that, they're all under the same general organization, so I would guess that they talk. But having said that, and especially in talking to the Russians that have been there, their programs tend to be quite compartmentalized because they don't want information leaking out. This is an impediment to progress, but of course it's also a way of keeping secrets. Now, whether that compartmentalization is applied even more firmly to the different disciplines, the missiles versus the nuclear programs, I don't really have any insights there.
We put this panel kind of as dry from the primer, and because it really touches a couple of key bases, that the elements of a nuclear weapons program are the special nuclear materials, which David, I guess quoting from the National Intelligence Estimate, called the long pole in the tent, weaponization, over which, and he characterized, as did Michael, the debate about what the IAEA has. It's sort of left as questions rather than a definitive conclusion about weaponization. And Michael Ellemans addressed the third dimension of it, the delivery piece of it, and in his presentation noted that no other country, had gone for a 2,000-kilometer kind of launcher, which did not have a nuclear weapons program. The origins of the ballistic missile program in Iran, dated, got a real push during the Iran-Iraq War when Iran was on the receiving end of barrage Scud attacks from Iraq, and a program that really got its boost during the Iran-Iraq War in the context of large-scale conventional exchanges, primarily where Iran was on the receiving end from Iraq, has now gone through kind of this evolution into the current phase. So what other things would you be looking at on the ballistic missile side that would feed into these other two dimensions of the weaponization piece and the special new nuclear materials? What would we be looking for? For example, you did discuss precision guidance. Is that something, how difficult is that to achieve? Would the Iranians, would that be a priority for them, or if it is indeed tied to nuclear weapons kind of capability, even as a hedge, is precision, development kind of a less of an urgent requirement?
It's an interesting set of questions, I think, in the one question you asked. First, a comment about what we believe are the rationales for their programs. And their experience in the Iran-Iraq War certainly played a key role in their desire to get their initial capabilities, the Scuds missiles that they got from, I think first from Libya and then from North Korea and Syria. Iran's, although they have some of the best trained pilots in the Persian Gulf region, they really lack operational aircraft and modern aircraft. And so they have an extremely limited ability to deliver any kind of ordnance or armament beyond their borders. So they view ballistic missiles as the primary means for, extending their reach. It is also an effective deterrent. In talking to people throughout the Gulf, when I've briefed them on their Iran's missile capabilities, they are always they're constantly asking, well, what can I expect from attack? How, what are they going to do to us if I'm at the receiving end? And what can I do in terms of defense? What missile defense assets do I need? So there's clearly a concern at the receiving end, and I believe that Iran sees this as a very effective deterrent against the U.S. It's part of their kind of asymmetric capabilities in general.
So the optic of the ballistic missile was not only the nuclear dimension, but as a substitute for having advanced, fighter aircraft, a serious air force.
Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of the future, I think improved accuracy is not where they're going to focus because it's out of their reach. I mentioned that GPS is not a magic bullet that allows you to achieve great accuracy. The real issue is either you have to have terminal guidance systems, which is very complex. Even the U.S. and China and Russia struggle with those technologies. The key is how accurately or precisely can you turn off the engine, and that usually requires a post-boost vehicle. We don't see any indication that they're looking at those technologies. There's other things you could do, but it's, again, beyond their capabilities at this time. What to watch for, what surprises me is now they have the solid propellant capability, why aren't they building hundreds of solid propellant Scud-like missiles? Basically the same range, payload characteristics as the Scud B and C, but only in a solid propellant form. They could use them for mass fire across the Gulf. The fact that they haven't done that yet is a little bit surprising to me, and I'm not sure why that is. For nuclear capability, I suppose the one thing to watch for is the attempts to create longer range systems, and we don't see any indication that they want to go beyond 2,000 kilometers plus or minus 10%. If they want to go beyond that, there's a number of challenges that they have to face. One is testing outside of their own country territory. The length of the country is about 2,000 kilometers. This means they have to build sea-based tracking and telemetry stations. It's not a simple task, but if they start doing that, it would be an excellent indicator that they intend to test longer-range systems.
Question, we'll take the gentleman over here. And I think that's going to have to be the last question because time's up.
Thank you. My name's Alan Crass. Used to be at the State Department. This is for David Albright. David, I read not long ago a small article, I think it was in the Washington Post, by some Iranian official who said that they had made a technological breakthrough and they were now able to fabricate the fuel for the research reactor in Tehran. If they can do that, then that really changes the whole politics of the swap idea, the idea of exporting the uranium to get it fabricated into fuel. How credible was that little piece that I read?
Could you just answer that, David, in the broad context of indigenous production capabilities? Because when you talked about the P1 and indigenous, are they making, in terms of the technology denial, do they need the parts to make them, or are they trying to covertly import components for just essentially assembly inside of Iran? So I think in terms of technology denial, the ability to cut off indigenous production is critical, both in terms of centrifuges and, as the gentleman asked, the actual material.
Yeah, on the centrifuge, where they're at now is that they need raw materials. Some can look very sophisticated, but they're not trying to buy centrifuge components. They're also buying what we'd call cascade equipment vacuum measuring equipment, vacuum pumps, things like that, that they're trying to reverse engineer but have trouble making reliable systems. Now, in the fuel, I forget when last year they announced they were going to put together the fuel capability, fuel manufacturing capability. I think no one denied or didn't believe they wouldn't do it, and they're about on schedule. The question, though, is can it be certified safe for use in a research reactor? And unfortunately, that's Iran's decision. I mean, well, there are international standards, as you know, on fuel. I mean that if you're going to sell it internationally, there Western countries or Japanese or whoever are going to impose requirements on the safety of the fuel and to demonstrate the safety. So, for example, one thing that is a little surprising is you see no decision by Iran to say, okay, we're going to make some test elements, put them in the reactor and see if they survive. So it just appears they're trying to rush to create a capability and somehow be able to announce, okay, now we can make the fuel. But from a technical point of view, you're long from being able to really make safe fuel at that point. And that's what I think. Well, that's true, but I think the assessment is that they haven't been getting a lot of help on these 20% enriched uranium fuels. We'll see if that's right, but the issue will become, I think, the safety of the fuel, but in the end, as you're pointing out, it's up to Iran to make that decision, and
Would you speak to the danger from the 20% fuel? I mean, the stockpile is growing. There's another source.
Well, but we're just talking about the danger posed by fuel going into a research reactor.
Stockpile, because that's the last question. There's a stockpile of 20% enriched fuel.
Right, I forget what it is, 30, 40 kilograms.
Maybe if it's twice as much, and you'll actually have enough for a weapon.
Right. No, that's right. And then you have your dash times get even less.
That was the problem with the deal
Yeah.
that Michael described, was it would have left this residual amount of low-enriched uranium that could have been enriched further to make HU.
And the problem with the deal with Brazil and
Yeah,
Turkey
exactly.
was that they could continue making 20%. It was even mentioned that they would stop doing 20%, and it is an absolute requirement of the United States and I think all the six, that if there is any kind of fuel deal, they stop making the 20% right away. And about that fuel assembly that David was talking about, the Iranian ambassador to Vienna has already made a threat prior to the talks that this is a last chance, because if they don't make a deal, Iran's going to make its own fuel for the Tehran reactor. So.
But these threats are to be expected too. I mean, I mean, if you look at other cases, if you put sanctions on a country, take South Africa, they certainly went ahead and tried to reverse engineer and build things. They still preferred buying overseas. I mean, if they learned to make a vacuum furnace, for example, in the bomb plant, they used the one that they had imported. And so these countries, even a country like South Africa, has trouble reverse engineering. But I think the bottom line, though, and if I can take the opportunity to offer a slightly different version than Michael.
We're just about to wrap up, so if you could make it
I could do it quickly.
succinctly.
I think
Thank you.
the problem that I see with Iran is, in a way, it's the problem that we faced with South Africa in the 1980s, and with Brazil in the 1980s. I mean, you know it when you see it, and I would say one of the key indicators that I'm looking for to see if we've turned a corner with Iran, do they admit their bomb-making program? And in South Africa, that was critical. Couldn't let South Africa off the hook until they admitted they actually had a nuclear weapons program. And that took 2 years after they signed the NPT for South Africa to come to that revelation. In Brazil, they right up front said we had a bomb program. And part of the problem is that if Iran isn't willing to come demonstrate that kind of openness, it's hard to trust anything they do. And that's really, from my point of view, from a technical perspective, the problem with Iran is all these things, freeze for freeze, not accepting a suspension. We don't trust them. And we know that they can agree to the additional protocol one day and turn it off the next. And so I think that until we see an epiphany in Iran, can't trust them on any level. When they do have it, we can trust them on almost any level. And it's not surprising that when you look at Brazil, their centrifuge program that was part of the core issue about nuclear weapons survived and went on a limited scale. South Africa's civil enrichment program went on. 2 years later or so, they ended it because why would they waste all this money when they can buy the LEU much more cheaply?
But the IA has urged them to make a clean breast of it, and they refused precisely.
Well,
to
but
do
that's
that.
the dilemma. And do we accept that? Do we, even though we don't trust them, how can we have
We're still
a
talking.
long-term solution?
And the Iranians sort of say, we want to be treated like Japan, and our response is, well, you're not Japan after the years of cheating. And unfortunately, though, on a PR front, the P5+1 have really kind of lost the battle in the sense that the interpretation of Article 4 as allowing unfettered right to fuel cycle allows the inherent hedge option that Michael referred to, or you did, David, from the IAEA inspector,
And
that
supported by the non-alliance.
it's an inherent hedge, and it provides a basis for those who are unwilling to take meaningful action to not take that action.
But it's always been there. Let me
Yeah,
say,
it
it's
has.
always been there. It was there in the 80s with South Africa and Brazil. They're always going to claim this right, it's really, have they turned the corner, and can you trust them?
I just
And
think that
it
Well, we'll
trumps
turn-
the Article 4 that
Whether there'll be an epiphany or not is no doubt the topic of a future meeting
Yeah.
sponsored by the Middle East program under the superb leadership of Dr. Hala Sfendiari. We thank her and her program for putting today's session together, to Robin Wright for the Iran primer, which is just, I commend to all of you online. If not a hard copy, it's just an essential resource. And finally, let me thank our speakers today for an outstanding presentation. Please join me in thanking them.